Hello, everyone, from wherever you're listening, whether it's in outer space or home here on Earth. Welcome to the Saturn Force Podcast, Chapter 2, The Fall of the Saturn. I'm Andy, aka Love Retro BTW on Twitter and Twitch, and Cafe BTW on YouTube and TikTok. Welcome to the second chapter of the Saturn Force Podcast, a podcast brought to you by a loving fan of this wonderful, ill-appreciated machine in the US in the 90s. A podcast for the person that's searching on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, looking for the one podcast that puts all focus and effort towards the Sega Saturn. Then you are in the right place. Now, if you listen to my first episode of the Saturn Force Podcast, it was very much focused on my personal life and how my parents' divorce single-handedly affected my ownership of a Saturn in 1995. A little recap is my father left my mother, married the woman he later called my stepmom. And because of that, he had guilt. And with that guilt, he bought me a Saturn in 1995 because he felt bad that he left my mom to be with my stepmom, who I now love. If you'd like to check out the first episode, I suggest you check it out because it's really important to understand why I'm doing a Saturn podcast and why it means so much to me. And with tragedy in your life, like divorce, it could bring you such joy like the Saturn. Now, the chapter today, and we're hitting the heavy hitters first on the Saturn, kind of like taking broad strokes on the culture of the Saturn. Why was it so ill appreciated in the US? But why did it fall in the US? Why in the US market? I'm American. I can't speak for other markets. I know other markets did well. Japan the Saturn was extremely successful there. But I can speak for the fall in the United States. And there were a lot of reasons why the Sega Saturn, which was the sixth gaming console by Sega, named after the sixth planet from our sun. And to think that they wanted to do something right after the Genesis, the 3DX, the Sega CD, because the Genesis soon later did not look like the Genesis anymore. So there were rumblings of the Saturn. Obviously, one major downfall to the Saturn on its release, third-party developers had no clue that the system was coming out much earlier than anticipated in the US. So the system was severely lacking in diverse titles on launch. Due to the earlier release date, retailers weren't able to advertise and prepare for the launch. You see, the Saturn was released in Japan, and the US was getting ready to do their push. And without telling anyone, even the developers that were the third-party developers working hard at developing for this console had no idea that they were going to do this early release. And that really hindered the development of the Sega Saturn third-party games. Another problem that caused the fall of the Saturn was the lack of Sonic the Hedgehog games. That's not for the lack of trying, though. However, the production on the next installment of the series, Sonic X-treme with an X, was so troubled that the game was delayed numerous times before finally being canceled. Instead, a port of the poorly received Genesis title Sonic 3D Blast was released for the Saturn, which didn't exactly light up the sales charts. And that was a problem. You go from this system that single-handedly destroyed Nintendo in the 90s. You beat the juggernaut with Sonic the Hedgehog 1, 2, and 3, and Sonic and Knuckles. I mean, you can go down the list. And the fact that they just were lacking on a Sonic the Hedgehog game on the Saturn on release day, there is no excuse, because Sonic Extreme should have been a release title for the Saturn in the United States. But for some reason, Sega didn't follow that path. They thought that getting to market first was more important than really figuring out what worked for them so well with the Genesis was Sonic. Some elements of Sonic Extreme were allegedly incorporated into Sonic Adventure, which later released on the Dreamcast. One of the most recognizable mascots in video game history, even in this time frame in the 90s, was not solely the main marketing push in the US. The fact that they did not get the Sonic Extreme game out on the Saturn was a big loss in the public facing market. Now, don't get me wrong. The Saturn is unbelievable. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this podcast if there weren't some amazing games, which we're going to do plenty of episodes where we're going to talk about amazing Saturn games. But we're talking about the kind of like hiccups and missteps on the way to why the Saturn failed. And that's what chapter 2 is all about here. We're talking about not what our opinions are on how good the games were. It's why they didn't release a certain game that actually never ended up coming out on this particular system, except for Sonic Jam, which was the compilation Saturn Sonic game that had a 3D element in it when you were walking around in between the menus. But that wasn't enough because that was a compilation of Sonic games. Now, another thing that Sega did super well was sports, especially on the Genesis. You know, you have early Maddens and Joe Montana Sports Talk football. You'd think that they'd be able to move over to and really hit home on their sports, which they end up doing on the Dreamcast, because literally EA says, we're not making games for the Dreamcast. So Sega's like, all right, we'll make NFL 2K and NBA 2K. And the rest was history there. We know that NFL 2K5 was the last football game because of the license BS through EA and Madden. But we all know that 2K basketball is the leading franchise, I should say, of basketball video games, IPs. It's like the Madden of basketball, honestly. Much better game than Madden is, but you know what I mean. So the Saturn comes out and, you know, it doesn't do super well in the US. A good example is, like I said in the first episode, I was the only one in my friend circle that even had a Sega Saturn. It wasn't even relatively close to anyone's radar to purchase it, at least for me and my friend circle. So let's talk about the end life of the Saturn and not forget that even though it failed in marketing in launch, we should note the final years of the Saturn and the amazing games that they put out in the US. And we're going to roll down 1997. Super Puzzle Fighter 2, Die Hard Arcade, Mega Man 8, Fighters Megamix, Albert Odyssey, Shining the Holy Ark, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, the 10-player Sega Saturn Bomberman, Sonic Jam, Resident Evil, Last Bronx, Duke Nukem 3D. And in 1998, you have all those great games in 97, and Sega of America says, we're going to end the Saturn. Yet they put out a couple of EA NHL games like NHL 98. In February of 1998, Sega releases the predecessor to Decathlete, which is a kind of track and field sports game, which in itself is an amazing game, with Winter Heat being kind of like a Winter Olympics version of it. May of 1998, House of the Dead comes out. It had poor textures, but it was fun to play. A few days after, Panzer Dragoon Saga was released, the third and final of the Panzer Dragoon Saga. And this one was way more story focused with turn-based combat mechanism. A month after that, Burning Rangers comes out. Sonic Team's final game on the Saturn. The team that made Nights into Dreams, the team that did Sonic but didn't make Sonic technically on this console, they come out with an outstanding game in Burning Crusade, a fantastic, beautiful, fun game. And you know what the final game for the Saturn was? Well, it was Magic Knight Ray Earth, which was a game that actually was released in Japan in 1995 to only be released 3 years later at the very last release, actually the last release game in the Saturn cycle. That is crazy that this game didn't come out sooner, but it took that long for them to translate it, to get it over to the US. By the time the Dreamcast came out, though, after all, so that was the end of the Saturn. It's a short story told by me in a very short manner. But you go through those lists of games and you wonder, why is the Saturn now so appreciated? Saturn is the system that you missed out on, isn't it? You hear this episode right now. If you were as old as I was in 1995, you might have known of the Saturn's existence, but you ignored it. And now you want to go back to it, but the games are too expensive and you can't afford them because you can't. The Sega Saturn American run is so expensive that even sport games now are getting expensive. And there were some good sport games on the Sega Saturn, okay? You had World Series Baseball, you had Decathlete and Winter Heat, NBA Action 98, NHL All-Star Hockey 98, Worldwide Soccer 98. Some really good sport games, actually. Mike Ditka Quarterback Attack, which was a FMV football game, which actually was pretty fun in its own right. But by the time the Dreamcast came out, it was too late because Sony had already flooded the market. The damage was done, and it was over. Sega, because of the Saturn, trickled into the Dreamcast release, and it all had to do with kind of missteps in the American market, in my opinion. And that is my opinion. I can't say that that's the main crux of the reason, but there's a good reason why Sega had to pull the plug. And not only that, they missed a big one with the Dreamcast because they didn't put a DVD player in it. And I don't blame them because they said this is a gaming machine. The Dreamcast is a gaming machine, and it is. Dreamcast is probably one of the best retro consoles you can ever want to try to own or buy. It's so worth it. The Saturn is worth it too. But as we learn in this episode, the fall of the Saturn was just, it was kind of like too fast, too soon, and no one got to really enjoy it. And now we look back on it and we really wish we were there. And I always think about alternative realities, right? I always think about what if the Saturn was pushed back and Sega said, look, we're not pre-releasing it ahead of schedule. We are going to wait another 4 months to give our developers time to finish their third-party ports. We also have a Sonic game we'd like to get released on this thing. I think they could have done a lot to save, because everyone thinks the Dreamcast was the end-all be-all and that was it, but it really trickled from the Saturn missteps into the Dreamcast missteps. And it's a shame because I always think about, what if Sega was still in this console game? I wonder if Microsoft would have even gotten involved. It's really interesting because Sega did the right thing. They probably would no longer be here if they didn't do it the right way. But I always tell people, you know why Sega is around right now? It's not because they're selling software. It's because the Sonic the Hedgehog IP is probably worth billions alone. Just like Mickey Mouse for Disney and just like Mario for Nintendo. Probably a top 5 most recognizable figure in the world. And we're talking about a hedgehog from a video game. Sonic is worldly, adopted, accepted, remembered. And not only that, the recent movies, the two Sonic movies, are some of the best video game adaptations ever made. Outstanding, and big ups to Jim Carrey for his fantastic work as Dr. Robotnik, because who else would pull that character off like he did? I hope and cross my fingers that he makes one more jump to do the third movie, and I want to see the heavy set version of Robotnik. Like, for instance, this whole thing in Sonic the movie is you see this like growth of Robotnik, and it'd be interesting to see him heavy set in the third movie, but I don't know if that's going to happen. And I'm going off a little bit of the rails here. But what I do love about the Saturn is it kind of falls in line with the GameCube these days, where the GameCube was also not appreciated when it was out. And now today, GameCube is sought after and also very pricey on some of the best games out there, just like the Saturn, the American run Saturn. So yeah, it's just been interesting to really learn about, and obviously my interpretation of the Saturn fall is very casual, because that's what this podcast is all about. It's really more about feelings towards the Saturn and a lot of connecting through my experience being a 1995 Saturn owner. But I'm here for you because I want you to want to have and be able to listen to a podcast that just talks and riffs about the Sega Saturn. And that's what the Saturn Force Podcast is all about. And they're not going to be hour-long podcasts. I noticed that the first episode was only 22 minutes, but I felt like it was enough. And I do another podcast called Cafe BTW, a gaming morning podcast, which you could check out on my YouTube. That is a very, typical live video podcast, but this is just audio so that I can rant and give my love to what this system is and how much it means to me, because not enough people out there are talking about it. And when I go to search for podcasts, there's not many out there, right? So with that said, we're nearing the end of chapter 2. Now, if you happen to be listening to this podcast, we only have 2 episodes, but I know a couple of people have been listening to it. Comment on the YouTube video or DM me across my socials. You could find me at LoveRetroBTW on Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch. You could also find me as Cafe BTW on TikTok and Cafe BTW on YouTube. And that's where we have this show available across Spotify, Apple Podcasts, also on my YouTube. You could listen to it. But I really appreciate anyone that has given this podcast a shot. And I hope it's a little bit different, because it's less about really getting into the nitty-gritty of everything, but kind of casually shooting the crap. I don't want to say the SHIT word, but I'll just say crap. So that it's like we're sitting on a porch together, reminiscing about how we either got to play the Saturn or our friends had it at their house. I'm wishing you all a really, really safe weekend, and night. I'm Andy, and this was another chapter. We'll see you next month.